I'm glad Roger ended really talking about optimism, although not a false optimism. Because normally in this situation one should be pretty depressed actually. You got incredible civil liberties situation here at home, which I'm going to talk about briefly. You have permanent war, you have a coming war on Iraq, and yet I see a lot of movement against what's going on. I think I've been at teach-ins or speak-outs or demonstrations almost every day for the last 2 weeks on Iraq. It's going on in colleges throughout the city, throughout the country. And so there's a lot of resistance. I think there's a lot of discomfort by American people about this war. The polls are even or a little bit in favor of the war, but as soon as you say without the UN, the polls are actually running against the war. So I do think there's a certain amount of discomfort. One of the things I'll get to is, unfortunately, the people in power, who I think are really a clique of right-wingers, and you don't have to even use the word warmonger, you can actually describe them, and that's what will be what it comes out, who are ideologues, essentially, and aren't listening at this point to what public opinion is. But at the same time, I think there is growing resistance. We at the center have actually, since 9/11, taken an incredibly strong position against what the administration is doing, particularly around civil liberties at home, and now obviously with regard to a war in Iraq. And I just want to give you a little bit of sense of that, to see the sense of both legal struggle as well as political struggle. I mean, we've been fanned out to, particularly after 9/11, to advise Muslim groups on their rights, speaking everywhere we can, talking about civil rights, talking about civil liberties, talking about really the war administration that we have in power. But just for today, for example, I came from, first we had a moot court in my office on the case we brought on behalf of Dennis Kucinich, challenging the termination of the ABM treaty by the President of the United States. Now, I never even knew, I do a lot of international law, I didn't know a lot about the ABM treaty, but what that did was basically say with the Soviet Union that, look, we won't build a Star Wars if you don't build a Star Wars, because if one of us builds a Star Wars, then we won't have mad or mutual assured destruction. One of us will be able to bomb the other with impunity, and therefore if we don't have a Star Wars, if one bombs the other one will be wiped out, and therefore we're all going to be so-called safe. At least that was the theory. The United States abolished that. I mean, the United States terminated that 3-year President Bush did. Dennis Kucinich has gone in with 31 other Congress people saying that he had no right for a unilateral termination of that treaty. It had to be either the Senate or the Congress because it's the equivalent of legislation. What it leads to, of course, is the reason that treaty was abolished is exactly what Roger was saying. It's about using nuclear weapons in a unilateral way. And that's what's really going on with that kind of situation. The U.S. wants to be free to build Star Wars so it can protect itself against other people using nuclear weapons, supposedly, while we go off and are able to use them ourselves. The second case we're filing a brief on today is called Turkmen. In Turkmen, we represent all the 9/11 detainees who were picked up after 9/11. Muslim groups say as many as 3,000. The last time Ashcroft said anything about it was in November when it was 1,200. What they've done with those people is after they've actually completed their immigration processing and either been deported or want to leave voluntarily, the United States government is keeping them in jail pending so-called criminal investigation. Now, none of these people were involved in 9/11. They're not terrorists. They're essentially, what we're saying is using the immigration law as a way of picking up people for criminal law investigation purposes. We claim that's unconstitutional. We're filing that today. I also personally represent the Guantanamo detainees, which has been an extremely interesting case today. And I have one client who I hope is getting out soon, not one we filed a case for, but as you saw the pictures in the paper today, look at who they're letting out now, finally, after 10 or 11 months. And had they obeyed the law and had they not been straight executive detentions, what we would have had here is competent tribunals under Geneva or under some other legal system, and had those people out much more quickly. It's executive detentions. It's really a nasty business, executive detentions. It means no court review. It's what's happened to the 9/11 detainees. That's some of the ways in which we've been aggressive. It leads us a little bit into the Iraq situation, because here we are sitting at my office discussing all of these civil liberties violations, of which there's, I think you can make a list of a score, but I put them into categories of secrecy, executive detentions, thinking and speaking freely, which is all the FBI spying stuff, and the treatment of non-citizens are sort of 4 broad categories. We're discussing, well, how do you stop this? How do you really make an inroad in the United States? How do you get the courts to go your way? How do you get the population to say, we care about our civil liberties? And one guy in the room is sitting around and we're saying, so Michael, you know, as many lawsuits as you file, as much as you try and get the public to try and do something about this, you know, you're not going to succeed very well because people are frightened. And when people are frightened and when people are scared, when they're frightened of the next terrorist act, when courts are frightened by a permanent war, they're going to accept what the government's saying. They're going to say, well, it may not be perfect to jail 3,000 people after 9/11. Maybe some of the people in Guantanamo are innocent completely. Maybe some of them shouldn't be combatants. But we're going to accept that, and the courts are going to accept it. So the real problem here is, how do you make people safer? And what he then said, look, as long as the Middle East is roiling, as long as we're going to attack Iraq next, people aren't going to feel safer, and they actually aren't going to be safer. More acts of terrorism will follow, and people will not be safer. And I tell that story really because it's the close interlink there is between war abroad and protecting our liberty at home. And it really says to me that the fight for civil rights and civil liberties at home is really very much connected with the fight against a permanent war abroad. That being said, I want to discuss 2 or 3 things about more closely about Iraq today. One is the legal issues. Secondly is some of my thinking, and I think Roger said some of it, of what is really going on here. And thirdly, what are some of the consequences of the war, one of which I think we've talked about in terms of civil liberties. First, legally. I'm not sure I'm a pacifist, but I probably am. I filed a lawsuit against every single war and military action this country has been in since the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was just at the tail end of my becoming a lawyer. It was concluding, and I wound up not being able to file a lawsuit against the Vietnam War, although there were lawsuits filed. I would say that of the 14 or so lawsuits that the Center and I have filed, we've essentially lost everyone. But in the last Iraq War in 1990, we came closer than we ever came. And actually, in some ways, you can look at what happened was a victory, although it turned out to be a nice legal victory, but a Pyrrhic one in some sense. We filed a case called Dellums v. Bush. We represented Congressman Dellums. Before the war actually began, 500,000 troops surrounding Iraq, and no authority from Congress to go to war. And it was going to be a close vote in Congress, and we all knew it. And in fact, it wasn't clear that the first President Bush could get the authority of the President under the Constitution, which we have said in all our cases throughout should be required. And we got Judge Green, who was a very good judge in the District of Columbia, and he wrote an opinion in which he didn't give us our declaratory judgment that the war was illegal, but he basically said so in the opinion. He basically said, look, this is the kind of war, the kind of troop involvement that you actually need to get the consent of Congress for. And so we considered it a victory, and of course about 2 days later, in part because of that lawsuit, the President went to the Senate, particularly, the House was always a given at that point, went to the Senate and I think got authority to go to war with Iraq 52 to 48 or some very, very close, a vote like that. So I do consider that the closest we've come to actually getting a court to say you need to go to Congress first to get the authority. We also filed a case which is, again, is relevant to what Roger was saying about journalists covering the war. There's been a steady erosion of the permission of journalists to get on the front lines and see what our U.S. troops are doing. Obviously, Vietnam was a high watermark, and that's what the Pentagon didn't like. They didn't like the fact that journalists were showing us what was actually happening in Vietnam. And then you slide downhill, Grenada, they're taken in on a boat, taken in later, Panama, not in again. And then finally in the Iraq War, we filed a case, I think it was called, it was the nation we were representing, I don't know if it was a Nation v. Bush or something like that. Again, we had a very good judge in the case. They were keeping people off the front lines. Again, the case was mooted because the war was over quickly, but again, the judge wrote a very significant opinion basically saying, you know, it was a serious issue here about the keeping of journalists away from war. So I've had a lot of experience with litigating against war. We're not going to be able to bring a case against this war because the Supreme Court has utterly closed up the hole of congressional standing, not completely, enough so that we're still going to be able to argue the ABM case maybe. But in terms of congressional plaintiffs bringing these kind of lawsuits, cases like Raines v. Byrd and a bunch of others have basically made congressional standing very suspect. Which brings us to the authority for this war under the Constitution so far. Most of our wars, there was no authority under either the War Powers Resolution or under the Constitution. In this one, as people know, a couple of weeks ago, the President did get authority from Congress to go to war against Iraq. And I don't have the resolution in front of me, but as I recall, there were two very interesting provisions. It says the President can determine when to go to war against Iraq if he determines that Iraq is a threat to the United States. Now what's interesting about that is the resolution that was defeated, that was put in before, had the words, if Iraq is an imminent threat against the United States. And Congress didn't pass the words imminent, they just passed the word threat, which, as you'll see, will bring us into the UN Charter and what really is permissible under international law to go to war against the country. Because according to the UN Charter, and we'll look at that, you really need to have either the UN's authority, the Security Council, or you have to be acting in self-defense. A threat is not, an attack of a country because it's a threat is not considered self-defense. So the US Congress already is taking a huge step backward in terms of what fundamental international law, certainly since the Second World War and the UN Charter, now requires, which is basically an armed attack, and at most, as we'll get to, maybe anticipatory self-defense if you're actually going to be imminently attacked. So already you can see that they moved away from what I consider to be strong dictates of international law and what the U.S. is required to do. The second way they said the President could go to war was to enforce, if he determined it was necessary, to enforce United Nations resolutions. Now think about that for a second. There's a lot of United Nations resolutions out there. A lot about Israel, there's a lot about other countries in the world that are there but are not being enforced with military force. Now should it be the rule that, let's say tomorrow, Guatemala decides that Israel isn't complying with the UN resolution, and therefore should Guatemala go to war against Israel, and say you're not complying with the resolution? Obviously not under law. A country, once it's in the UN, can't simply decide the UN passed a resolution. In their view, the country isn't obeying that resolution, and therefore, in their view, they will take the position of going to war. But of course, that's what our Congress gave to the President. They said to the President, you can enforce UN resolutions. You can first decide, is it a violation of the resolution? And secondly, what are the consequences of the violation? So that's the authority that the President now has under the U.S. Constitution. Is it enough authority? Most people would argue that it's enough authority. Are there some arguments that it's not enough authority? Sure. One argument is there's a UN treaty that says that you have to have either the UN authority or operate in self-defense. But most lawyers will tell you that the U.S. Congress, particularly with the approval of the President who signed the bill, can violate treaties and violate international law, and that's the law of the United States. They can do it. That doesn't mean it's okay under international law, but under our domestic law, according to most law scholars, you can violate international law. Of course, we have, as lawyers, we always have arguments that this is a fundamental norm of international law. It's Hughes Kogan. You can't violate it. And there's some argument that international law is embodied in our Constitution and its passage, and therefore you have to stay within its strictures. But generally, you could say, or many would say, that the U.S. has now been given the authority it needs under at least the U.S. Constitution. As I say, I would still make an argument that you have to have UN authority for that war. Let's go to the UN now. The UN really changed what the situation was after the Second World War. It basically prohibited the use of force except as authorized by the UN Charter. There's only two circumstances. That's when the Security Council authorizes the use of force to protect international peace and security. They can only do that after peaceful means have failed, which means to say, if you look at it in this context, they really have to have decided first that peaceful means have failed, which means inspections, etc., have failed with Iraq, or that that's threatening international peace and security, whatever those failures were. The UN Security Council at this point has not done that, and I want to talk about where that law is right now. And the second way is self-defense. That's Article 51. It's an armed attack on the country. Now that has been stretched and exaggerated, particularly during the Cold War. Doctrines like anticipatory self-defense, and that's really as far along the spectrum as it went. It didn't go to what we're talking about today, preemptive strikes. Preemptive strikes are not anticipatory self-defense. Preemptive strikes are the idea that somebody that somebody you're thinking in the future might be a threat, not because of what that person has right now or that country has right now, but because they might be able to build up a weapon or build up and do that, and then at some point attack you. And therefore you have to have a preemptive strike. It's also called, we call it a preventive strike. It's a future anticipated, not visible threat really, and it doesn't really fit at all with any traditional concepts of self-defense or any legal concepts under the UN Charter. That's what we're doing in talking about preemptive strikes, not allowed by the UN Charter. If you look at the current situation in the UN now, it's actually pretty interesting and somewhat better than I would have expected, considering the power of the United States and the ability to bribe countries, which is what actually happened in 1990 in terms of the countries on the Security Council. You don't have to read far and wide. All you have to read is the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times to say how these countries, how the U.S. is attempting to bribe countries. You already see that they're beginning to think about how to divide up the oil in Iraq afterwards. And France, it said in one of the articles I read, is very, very concerned that if they really block the U.S. from going to war with Iraq, and the U.S. does that anyway, then France is not going to get the oil out of Iraq. Russia, which has some 70 agreements with Iraq on exploiting the oil fields, assuming there was no embargo, also feels the same way. So there's a huge amount of leverage here from the United States. That's just one example in which the United States is obviously saying, look, if we go to Iraq, we're going to divide up the oil with you. And you already see there's articles about the number of U.S. oil companies interested in how the oil is going to be divided up, and there's contracts being entered into with the so-called Iraqi opposition, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of ability of the United States to push the Security Council in ways that it wants. And what's surprising so far is there has been the kind of resistance, the resistance there has been. What the countries want, what France and what Russia seem to want, and now apparently Mexico and possibly Ireland. Now Mexico is unclear to me, other than Vicente Fox is really angry at the United States over doing nothing about the immigration issue and the 3 million Mexicans living here and not doing anything about what Bush promised for the last year. So he basically really thumbed his nose right at Bush yesterday or the day before, causing Bush to make some dramatic statement. I think someone told me that Vicente Fox invited Bush to come down and visit Mexico next year, and Bush says, well, only if there's no war, or something like that. Only if we're not at war, implying a war with Mexico or something. But in any case, they want what's called a two-stage resolution. Two-stage resolution, first resolution, inspections, and only after there's something wrong or something fails or after the report comes back from the inspectors about what happened in those inspections, then the Security Council meets again and decides whether or not, what the consequences of that failure should be. Should it be further inspection? Should it be some other issue, or should it actually be the use of force? The United States, of course, does not want this. The United States, as if you've read Bush's speeches, basically put a gun to the UN's head and said, you either give us the force, or we're going to the right to use force, or we're going to do it anyway. So it doesn't sound like the most voluntary decision by the UN, whatever comes out. But the U.S. wants a one-stage resolution, and it goes to exactly the points I'm making. The U.S. wants a one-stage resolution that says, this is the inspections, and then if we, the United States, decide the inspections aren't adequate, and if we, the United States, decide what we want to do about that, then we can go in and use force ourselves without going back to the UN. So the U.S. is saying it's going to be up to us whether there's a violation of the inspection regime, and it's going to be up to us what the consequences of that are. And if you look at the language of the resolutions, they're very interesting here. There's this word material breach they're throwing around a lot in this resolution, and it appears twice in the U.S. version of the resolution, and it says, makes a finding that Iraq is in violation, Iraq is in material breach of past UN resolutions. Now, you're lawyers, or becoming lawyers, and if you have contracts, the idea of a material breach is if I have a contract with somebody else, and I did okay in contracts, but I don't remember much about it. But if I have a contract with somebody and there's a material breach, that means the contract is null and void. And we go back to as if there's, it's my option to say there's no contract any longer. Well, that's what's going on here. The original Iraqi use of force resolution is called number 678. It's 1990. It's the one that authorized the United States and the coalition partners to use force against Iraq. The ceasefire is called number 687. That's what's in effect today. There's a ceasefire with Iraq. What the United States wants to have happen it wants to have it said that Iraq has breached essentially the ceasefire and all the subsequent resolutions. Once it's a material breach, not just a breach, a material breach of 687, then basically the ceasefire is over, nullity, gone. No more ceasefire with Iraq. And what are the consequences of that? Well, according to the United States, you then go back to 678, which is the use of force resolution from 1990. So the United States then says we have the legal authority under 678 to use force, because 687, the ceasefire, is a nullity. That's what the struggle is about on one level in the Security Council. France is very afraid, correctly, that that's going to be the U.S. position. The other piece of language in the current proposed resolution is the serious consequences business. And that serious consequences is basically, Diplo speak for we can go to war. So if it says in the resolution, and Iraq can suffer serious consequences, it's not as broad as all necessary means, which was the 1990 resolution, but it's getting there. And it means, according to the United States, that they can use force to go into Iraq. Now, one thing that I was at a meeting this afternoon, and someone said something interesting about the Security Council. They said, a few days ago we saw an unprecedented thing, really, an open and public debate in the Security Council about the use of force against Iraq. And that's something that's interesting, because normally we've looked at it as they represent their countries, and they don't represent us, and they don't represent the world, and they don't represent peace, and they don't represent international law. But in fact, what's happening here in the Security Council is interesting to me, because I think that people are beginning now to directly lobby the Security Council. I mean, citizens are directly lobbying them. And if there's one thing we can do in the next, I would say, 72 hours to the next 4 days, there's lists of the Security Council members all over the place, that you can lobby them. You can go to the embassies they have, their missions in New York. You can fax them. And I'm not sure it'll make a difference, but you have to figure out a way to really give some of these countries backbone. And I don't just mean the veto countries, the 5, because you need 9 votes. And what the U.S. is worried about here is the 9 votes as well, as whether it gets a veto. If Mexico and a couple other countries vote against the United States, it's not going to have the 9 out of 15 votes it needs, and it's not going to have the authority. So is it going to stop the war? Look, I'm not saying, I don't know what can stop the war necessarily, but every little thing is important. And I consider the fact that the Security Council is now open really to public debate. And someone told me today that they may bring Nelson Mandela in to address the Security Council in the next day or two as a speaker against the war in Iraq. All very, very important. Do I have all my hope in it? No. But is it important? Absolutely. So there's one thing you can do, among everything else, is really get to that Security Council. That's the international legal situation. It's one in which the U.S. Obviously the Congress went way beyond what is authorized, and the real question is whether, with the kind of statements coming out of Washington from Bush and everybody, is whether they're going to, in the end, let the Security Council decide this matter, or whether they're just going to do it on their own. I'm going to just quickly go through the next 2 subjects, and then I want to get to questions. What is really going on here? I think Roger's explanation of this permanent war by really these guys, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Pearl, Bolton, we really had a clique of people take over the government that I think are ideologues and bent on using U.S. military might to rule the world. And in that sense, as I said, I think that the politics of opposition, and the fact that even though there was big demonstrations across the country, isn't as meaningful to them, because they really are on an ideological mission in some way. So when I ask myself what's really going on, is it a wag the dog situation because of the coming election? Timing-wise, I'm willing to say all those kind of things are possible. But is that what's really going on? I don't think so. As I said, I think it's a much deeper question. Is it because Iraq's a real threat? I have to say, I feel more threatened now that we're approaching war with Iraq and the aftermath than I felt 2 months ago. I feel much more threatened. I think there's going to be a much bigger increase in terror in this country as well as around the world. And if we already look at what's happened, and it's moving to consequences a little rather than what's really going on. Consequences. You've seen what happened in Bali. You've seen the killing of the American soldier in Kuwait. You've seen the attack on the French ship in Yemen. And, I could say that someone would say to me debating, well, Michael, that's going to happen anyway. Al-Qaeda's out there anyway. They're going to do this stuff anyway. Terrorists are out there anyway. You know, that may or may not be the case. But I have been reading carefully, and even U.S. officials on a number of occasions in the last 2 weeks have said the increase in terrorism is directly tied to our desire to go to war with Iraq and the proposed war with Iraq. So it's not just me saying it, it's actually U.S. counterterrorism officials saying that's going to cause a buildup of anger and hate toward the United States that's going to result in more terror. And then I read Tony Blair's statement, one of the big supporters of the war, as you well know. He said it's absolutely imperative that the U.S. start the negotiations again in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. Because if we don't, and we attack Iraq, it's just going to cause more and more terror. And at least if we show people that we're doing something about the Middle East, we might have a chance of pushing that terror back a little bit. Now, is that a reason not to go to war with Iraq? Well, obviously, if Iraq was about to, or the country is about to drop an atom bomb over New York City, that's not a reason not to go. But when you look at what the threat is from Iraq and how remote really it is compared to the real threats we're facing right now, and the consequences of that kind of threat, I think it is a good argument that you don't want to have this world roiling worse than it is right now and us feeling less safe than we do right now. So back to what is going on. Is it because it's a real threat? I don't think so. I mean, and all the stuff with the Iraq tie with Al-Qaeda, you've seen what happened with the so-called meeting in Czechoslovakia. That didn't really go on. You've seen that if you look at Bush's speeches, they're filled with stuff about Al-Qaeda, but they actually can't link Al-Qaeda to Iraq. There are ways of getting the American people, if you ask them, probably 70% think that Iraq is involved with Al-Qaeda, but no real evidence of it. Some people suggested Bush, his father, and they tried to kill his father and all that. All these are conceivable motives in there. They're all in there. Is it a way of deflecting people from the fact we didn't get bin Laden and now terrorism is spread out in all these unconnected cells all over the world? And is to divert attention? Does it divert attention from the economy? All those are factors. But I think more deeply is what Roger really has said. And what's interesting about the Pentagon, as he said, is they've actually written about this stuff. There's an article that I just really recommend, two of them, but one is it's in Harper's from about 2-3 months ago, and it's a sort of book review of Cheney's 1991 defense policy analysis that he did along with Wolfowitz and Powell when he was at the Pentagon. And it basically lays out what has now become the U.S. defense so-called national security strategy. And it lays out exactly what Roger said, basically preemptive strikes. We have to become the super dominant military power. And most interestingly, we have to not use, we have to not rely on and use international law, multilateral institutions, and international institutions like the UN. It's openly there in a 1991 document. These guys have now taken power, and they're putting that stuff out, and they're doing it right now in the Pentagon. So that's really what's going on. It's not about wag the dog. It's really about a method of U.S. domination of the world through its military. Consequences. We've talked a little bit about consequences. I believe strongly that I am less safe here and my children are less safe in New York because of the war, the impending war with Iraq. And I think we're going to be less safe going forward because of what this country is doing. I mean, even the CIA has made the statement that, look, right now you can conceivably, and it's one of the options, you can contain and deter Iraq. You can do inspections in Iraq. But you start making war against Iraq, what does it have to lose? To the extent it has chemical weapons, the CIA has said, well, it's much more likely that they're going to use them. Then you look at our situation. Look at the situation in Muslim countries. And take a country like Indonesia. Indonesia is sitting there. Look, what are its options? It's a Muslim country. If it joins the U.S. in the war with Iraq, or if other Muslim countries do, what's going to happen to the people in the streets of those countries? I mean, they're going to get more terrorism in those countries. Those countries aren't being given a great choice. If they don't join the United States, then of course the United States comes down on them as these countries that are supporting terrorism. So again, it's going to be consequence of this war is the difficult situation and the dangerous situation it's putting into a number of our Muslim allies. If you read the story about Turkey yesterday in the Times, Turkey is very concerned by the war. I mean, of course they are, because what they've done to the Kurds for all these years, and then all of a sudden you're going to be getting a conceivable Kurdistan on the border of Turkey. So Turkey is not too pleased about this war. Another consequence, which I've talked about, is oil. As I said, I think that we shouldn't underestimate that. Iraq's oil reserves are huge. It will become as big as Saudi Arabia in terms of OPEC, probably 10% of the world's oil in terms of its production in approximately 2 to 3 years. It's being divided up, as I said, by the countries. It's certainly a consequence that the United States wants. Those are some of my overall thoughts about the situation. As I said, I remain, despite this, despite what's going on, I think there's a lot of fight going out there. I think there's an option on Iraq. I think we can talk about that and containing it, deterring it. I don't think Iraq is a real threat right now. I do think that all of us have a real role and a function to do right now, and whether it's the UN or or our friendly senators who voted for the war, there's a real obligation really to get out and fight back against it. I'm not, about 4 days ago, I wasn't convinced this war was going to happen because I saw Bush, I saw the UN sort of beginning to stand up, Bush beginning to recede a little bit and saying, well, regime change might mean inspections. I don't know that today, and I'm not, but I think there's still probably a 2 to 4 month opening that we have in terms of stopping this war, and I think we ought to use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We now want to throw the floor open to discussion, comment, ideas. I'd like to start by making my own little comment, which is that I am clearly not a pacifist, as opposed to Michael. I do believe there are times when the use of force can be both lawful and moral, and even wise. I don't think this is a time, and I really thank our speakers tonight for beginning the discussion both of the specifics about this situation and for talking to us about ways to become involved, to build coalitions, and to become active about this incredibly important issue. The first comment, question, disagreement, debate? Yes, yes.
More of a question to the first speaker. When you talk about a human rights sort of paradigm to see the world in, how would human rights deal with somebody like Saddam, who clearly has no respect for it in the first place, and to what extent do multinational organizations? I understand unilateralism is certainly the least desirable response, but to what extent do multilateral organizations have an obligation to step up, and to what extent would they be willing to do so in this circumstance?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that there is no easy solution anywhere to any of these problems. I think that's one of the myths of this military. We're just going to go in and solve it, when in fact, that's making it worse. But just because that's making it worse doesn't mean there's a magic bullet that we support human rights and then everything is fine. There are a lot of governments around the world, including this one, but certainly others, that repress people. Iraq is a high example of that, documented. So, what I would say, what it would mean to have a human rights international law perspective, for example, would be, how different would things be if, at a government level, governments, U.S. in particular, had followed the lead of human rights organizations who were talking about what Iraq was doing and what Iran was doing, and how bad this war was between Iraq and Iran, and what was happening in terms of repression of Kurds. There was information coming out, and so there are a number of angles to look at it. One is there are groups trying to do this. Their work would be made much easier if the powerful states of the world supported that work instead of almost always consistently opposing it. I won't get into the history of the U.S. actually supplying the weapons that were used to commit human rights violations by Iraq. But that, again, is documented history. It happened. It happened with Osama bin Laden too, by the way. Right? We can't forget these things. That that to have a little context there as to how these people develop. So one thing is a human rights approach is proactive support. Another thing is that you need to therefore support indigenous forces. That's the most important thing that support human rights. And I'll use the example of sanctions. What are just sanctions and what are unjust sanctions? my opinion, just sanctions are sanctions called for by a repressed population to aid their struggle for freedom, South Africa. It's very clear. It's very clear that the majority of people in South Africa were willing to accept some economic pain because they felt, and their leadership that was legitimate felt, this is, okay, Iraq. You know, I went 3 times. You won't find people in Iraq not want to support sanctions. Why? Because it's killing their children for what? For what? Is it, you know, the regime stays in power stronger. So that's outside pressure, which is imperialism, which is not for the human rights of people. It's for your own narrow interests that are not those people's interests. Another thing is that you need to deal with the causes of the problem. If we're talking about weapons, arms control. So A, there is a multilateral regime for arms control. It's not perfect. And of course it is flawed. It's not going to stop everything. But it's constantly weakened by the U.S. and other countries, constantly. So what would it look like if it was strong? What would the ICC look like if it was stronger and it had the support of the U.S.? It would be much more effective, right? It would be much better. So it's better. It's not answering everything, but it would be better. And we can't forget that it's Western, largely, companies that have supplied proliferation all the time. Penalties on these countries, expose them, throw them in jail for 50 years for what they're doing, right? We can't forget of the weapons scene. So there's a huge range of policies that would have to change if we were going to be a human rights respecting nation, and the world was going to do that. So I think I won't get into the specifics on the Middle East on how that would go, but that's so big changes. And last thing to point out about Iraq. Often opposition movements come from a middle class. They come from a group of people where wealth has been redistributed and they're exposed to the world. What sanctions have done, what U.S. policy in Iraq in the last 12 years has done, is decimate that very sector, a private sector, an independent sector from the government, a middle-class sector. It's gone in Iraq. So people are hungry, and there's someone said that homeless, people trying to feed themselves are not good revolutionaries. It's not a good way to bring human rights and change the regime.
I noticed that when you first began speaking, Mr. Norman, that you prefaced it with, this is not going to sound like a conspiracy theory. And I've found that because of the journalistic regulations, regulations on journalism all over the Middle East, all over the world, every time you do try to present information that's not accepted by mainstream media, you sound like you're spewing conspiracy theories. What, if anything, can be done? What is being done? And how do we approach this problem? I think that's half of everything that's going on within this country, without this country, is because of these regulations on journalism. And it's very frustrating. So what do we do from here?
Well, it's a big, maybe I'll quickly, and then you should. Yeah, balance from the media would be great, and it's a huge problem. I know that one thing that a lot of protest movements are doing is targeting the media as well. I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's the answer, but I don't have a good answer as to how you can change that, because it's a deep-rooted thing right now, the way our media is, and it's a corporate-controlled media, and there are certain interests that they answer to, and they get information from government sources, and Rumsfeld is well known. It's closed off if you're a little critical. So there are all kinds of structural problems. One thing I would say is this. First of all, I don't believe polls, the way they're done. But they say, 30, 40% of Americans don't support this war? That, to me, is a phenomenally high number. Or maybe even if it's 30, it's phenomenally high, because this is a population that's being fed misinformation and propaganda through our media constantly. So that means 30 or 40% have actually overcome that level of propaganda, because there is alternative information out there. It is available. It's not easy. You need generally internet, or you need to be at a university. You need to be at a place where a lot of people don't have that. But that's a very hopeful thing to me. And that 30, 40% is more active, because they've had to overcome, and so they have a better sense. And so the support for this war and for this militarism is very shallow. It's very shallow. It's based on misinformation. I don't think most people truly support it. You listen to the interviews, and it's like, they just put out what they, he's going to attack, us nuclear bomb, and I don't want my children, but it's not conviction. So I think on the other side, it's more conviction. So I would just say that the media is a huge problem, but it's not, it can be overcome without changing the structure of the media can be overcome through people who are already educated through alternative means, educating each other.
I think the internet has actually had a big effect on that. I mean, it's given a lot of alternatives. There's a huge amount of information. Also, if you looked at the coverage of the demonstration was just terrible this time. I mean, the New York Times had a small article saying thousands of people when it's probably close to 100,000 or more. Yeah, so it was 150, 200, whatever it was. And the other papers were as well, with almost no coverage of it. So that's, but people should complain. I mean, one of the suggestions that came up today is they should not only complain to the Times and everywhere, they should go to everybody in the local town should go to their newspapers, not just about the demonstration, but about the war. And they should meet and we used to do this with all the wars. You go to the editorial board in every town, in Iowa and everywhere, and you say, this is what we think, and we're citizens, and you have to organize across the country that way with every single piece of the media.
If I may, I don't mean to monopolize, I'm sorry.
No, that's
But, I mean, I'm all for grassroots activism. I honestly do believe that, that's really the only real option that we have, internet, in the streets. But am I to understand that systematically, regulation-wise, there really is nothing that we can do to overcome
Well, it's not really
the
regulations,
biases?
it's
just the corporate, is there, there's no...
there's people who've been
Self-censorship. It's
Yeah,
not regulated censorship. Newspapers don't report this for a variety of reasons that are economic and political, but not legal.
My
FAIR,
question is, you
FAIR,
can't-
right?
my
The
question is,
organization
is
FAIR, F-A-I-R?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they do. That's what their main thing is. But there's not, we litigated in the Gulf War to get journalists in. And because they were only letting the journalists in from the big magazines, to the extent they let them at all, were Time, Newsweek, and we tried to get The Nation and others in, and we couldn't, we ultimately couldn't do it.
But I guess that is the fact that I've never heard of an answer that can change the media structure in a short time, tomorrow, et cetera. It doesn't mean that we are doomed because our media is feeding us disinformation. And I actually think it's quite amazing how much knowledge and activism there is in the American public when they're not getting anything. I traveled throughout Afghanistan, and Afghans who have no education know more about our policies in the Middle East, let alone Afghanistan, than Americans do. So, because Americans have knowledge, it's wrong information that they often get.
Yes.
For this, kind of put the war in perspective, how does this whole analysis change? And again, possibly looking ahead, like you said, this war is just going to go on with other countries after Iraq. How does it change with countries like North Korea, which have come forward and said, yeah, we do have this nuclear program, we've been lying to you, we've been violating treaties. Is it more tenuous, than the situation with Iraq from a legal perspective?
Well, look at Korea. That's an interesting thing to me. If Korea says they're starting to develop nuclear weapons, and then you read yesterday in the Times, if you read the Times, you can figure things out a little bit sometimes. Because then it says, Korea says, look, what do you want from us? We were painted as one of the three countries in the axis of evil. First, you're knocking off Iraq. You may knock us off next. We'll be glad to negotiate this if you recognize our sovereignty, agree to non-aggression, and stop interfering with us trying to get together with South Korea. So Korea is making pretty reasonable demands, and it does seem to me that in the Korean case particularly, that they should sit down. Much reminds me of the Cuba situation, where the Soviet Union puts missiles into Cuba, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, right after the Bay of Pigs, a couple years after, because they're afraid of being taken over by the United States again. And then the United States forces them to take the missiles out, but basically agrees not to be aggressive not to take over Cuba, again, not to have another attack. So that seems to me what has to happen here, but it again is because Bush is irresponsibly putting North Korea into a situation where they're saying, well, we're going to wipe you guys out next. If I were North Korean, that's what I would be thinking. Whatever we think of the leadership of North Korea, neither of these places, Iraq or North Korea, I don't think those guys are completely crazy. I think they can be deterred. In other words, I don't think that they're going to self-destruct. I don't think that all of a sudden that North Korea is going to take a bomb and bomb South Korea or bomb China and then get destroyed. I don't think it's going to do that. But I think what it's saying is, look, we want to be recognized as a country in which the U.S. is not going to be aggressive toward us. Roger, isn't he?
I would actually even go, and I think that's exactly right, and I agree, it's a very interesting proposition. And in fact, far from being crazy, there is, whether it's reasonable or one likes it, there is what I find an impeccable logic in the North Korean position as a response to what the U.S. has said, which is unilateral nuclear war, we're going to bomb everyone. Why are we going to attack Iraq? Because they don't have nuclear weapons. That's quite clear. If Iraq really had nuclear weapons and the means of delivery, the U.S. would not be rushing in there. Everyone sees that. North Korea sees that. And I have no doubt they're going to do everything they can to create a deterrent capability as a matter of rational survival. So this is what we're doing to the possibility of multilateral arms control, as an example. Look at India, Pakistan. I mean, we are clearly sending a message out that this is the new military world, and you will not be respected, and you may not even live unless you get weapons of mass destruction. That's the message to all the regimes. That's one message. The other message is you're a regime, you're brutal, you're repressive. Go kill your domestic opposition and call them terrorists. So.
But doesn't that support the preemption argument, and that even as a rational player, assuming that Saddam Hussein is, he might be a real devil of sorts, but he's also a rational player, and even if we did back down and followed a deterrent type of method in this, that he would still try to get nuclear weapons because he still wants to be the Mac Daddy leader of the Arab world, as he demonstrated in 1990 when the Iraqis sent their envoys to both the U.S. diplomats and the English diplomats and said, look, we're going to invade Kuwait, and we're going to possibly, at some point down the road, invade Saudi Arabia, and we're going to become the new oil middleman in the Middle East. And of course that, he miscalculated there, but doesn't that sort of past practice infer that a nuclear weapon would be a pretty damn good device to have if he still is on that course of trying to be the great leader of the Arab world? And if we don't stop him now, once he develops a nuclear weapon, it's a totally different ballgame. I mean, it seems like, it's you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
You're certainly damned if you do. You may not be damned if you don't. Because, see, I think you're giving the logic, and there is a logic to it, but it's a logic of endless war, right? Because it's the logic where we're the biggest military, we're going to keep everyone out, we're going to bomb anyone who might threaten us, which creates a fear, a logical fear on the part of every other country. They're going to bomb us if we get nuclear. No, they're going to bomb us if we threaten, but we better get nuclear. It's not going to deter, you think it's going to deter North Korea? Do you think it's going to deter Iraq? No, of course not. It has exactly the opposite effect, so the predictable result is what we're getting. Now the alternative is these multilateral systems, which might work. They might work. This way will work to get us war in Iraq, and it will work to get us war in North Korea unless they have the bomb and they deter the United States, and it will work to get us war everywhere.
Is that the multilateral system?
Well, certain. Well, inspections are obviously part of a multilateral system.
Right, but
sure.
I mean, that's been, I know this sounds like an old sort of Wolfowitz ideological argument. I don't want to align myself with that man, but hasn't the inspection regime sort of been a farce?
No, it hasn't.
Oh, really?
Not at all. Not at all.
According
What
to
you,
many UN weapons inspectors who
that's incorrect, and you can actually read UNSCOM reports.
Well,
you can read UNSCOM.
Then you have a war.
You can read UNSCOM reports on the web, but I'll give you an example. This is from the Christian Science Monitor. There's a lot of statements here, and you could look at Scott Ritter, but this gets back to the article that was specifically about the well-known public lies that the U.S. government told to justify the first Iraq war. So the quote is, "This administration is capable of any lie in order to advance its war goal in Iraq," says a U.S. government source in Washington with some 2 decades of experience in intelligence who would not be further identified. We don't know. It is one of the reasons it doesn't want to have UN weapons inspectors go back in, because they might actually show that the probability of Iraq threatening illicit weapons is much lower than they want us to believe. Okay? Now that, you look at the UNSCOM reports, which again are public information, on the basic issue of weapons inspections was not what Iraq had. It's what it could not be proven that it didn't have, right? And it's very difficult to do that. And if you read what Scott Ritter talks about, who is the chief U.S. weapons inspector, U.S., who worked for military intelligence previously, who, as an activist at the time, he may remember, he was known as the cowboy inspector. Because what he did is he created confrontations with Iraq so that satellite intelligence could try and find where Iraq is moving different assets under conflict. Okay, so this was someone who was dedicated and effective and well known about trying to find Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, and at the time in the U.S. media was lauded as a hero. Now, when he came out against the sanctions, and against the U.S. policy, because the reason there are no weapons inspectors right now, which you may know, is that because we bombed them out of Iraq, and that the UNSCOM had been converted into a spy operation, right? You probably read this, and he's
Their job is to ferret out.
No. You're missing the point. You're missing the point. Scott Ritter complained that it became a spy operation to look at how to target Saddam Hussein and what the points of economic and political and military vulnerability were for the next attack, and not to get their weapons of mass destruction. So Scott Ritter was ticked because he's an inspector who wants to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, who's being prevented from doing so by U.S. spying in his operation, and then the strikes came in and that ended it. And you could read all of his material. I mean, now suddenly he's like a crazy person, right, according to the U.S., because their former hero suddenly doesn't agree with their policy because he's seen inside it, and he can give information about it. But so you should read what he says about the difference between qualitative and quantitative disarmament. It's publicly available.
Of other weapons inspectors, and I'm not saying that he's crazy, but there's a plethora of other weapons inspectors who have said there was a cat and mouse game going on for years where they would try to talk to a nuclear scientist or a weapons expert in Iraq, and the Iraqi secret police or whatever their technical terms would be right there on top of them, and this is right on top of them, basically intimidating them, and if the guy said anything, he would disappear. And I mean, unless you think this is just all propaganda.
A lot of it is, not all of it, but a lot of it is. But I'll tell you, there's one other clear thing here. There's one other clear thing, which is, I don't know if you've read in Israeli papers, that Israeli intelligence doesn't believe that he has weapons of mass anywhere near the point, right? And one way you could kind of determine that, as a matter of logic.
Israeli intelligence, he would have. I mean,
no. One way you can determine that, whatever, is that Israel, as the obvious logical target for any weapons of mass destruction that this regime has, because it's deliverable within a short period, right? They would be very worried if this guy had them. And yet the Israeli government is pushing war big time. It's by far the biggest supporter of war. And part of that, outside the United States, sure. And part of that is based on their assessment that Iraq does not have this capability. So if you look at the more serious, reliable sources, it's pretty unanimous, as well as the UNSCOM reports, I'm telling you, that Iraq's capability has been vastly exaggerated for propaganda purposes.
And you think that there's maybe also an exaggeration that Saddam Hussein in particular wants to be the new oil salesman in the Middle East. That whatever he did...
That's a vast exaggeration. The United States is the oil salesman in the Middle East. Right?
No.
Yeah.
All right, fine. Then the producer...
And they want that, and they will do
that
it.
He wants to replace Saudi Arabia. You think that's baloney?
Yeah.
Really, I'm not trying to...
Okay, the next question, do you have anybody else who wants to say anything? Now we'll continue that dialogue. Somebody else?
So that just goes back to the point. I mean, I found it's in the upper academic institutions where people are less willing to accept that we're not really getting the truth. And because I've found that the intellectuals, the ones in the graduate schools, don't give much credit to the grassroots activists, to the non-mainstream information, that it's hard, everything comes off as a conspiracy. It's hard for people to believe other than what they see on CNN and other than what they see in the New York Times if they're not reading in between the lines. And I mean, that goes just back, I was just like, that's a prime example of how hard it is for people to see past what corporate America is telling us. I mean, I'm just saying.
Okay,
Oh,
over the right.
who hasn't asked the
Let me
question
go
yet?
over,
Oh, okay.
over the right, Mr. Bromley.
I had a question about, speaking of the people that are in charge right now, like Wolfowitz and all the people in those strategic places. I'm wondering, okay, say in 3 years or 2 years when there's another election and say a Democratic president is elected and he puts different people in those places, does it really make a big difference? I mean, are they then going to be able to go in, and even if in the next 2 years certain things have happened, can these new people in these places actually make a big enough difference to kind of, call the tide?
Look, I think the U.S. has obviously always had a certain amount of unilateralism and belief that they stand, as Albright said, we stand taller than everybody else and can see what's right for the world. I mean, they've always done that, but certainly there's been more ability and willingness to work with the UN and other administrations, and more ability to use international law and multilateral institutions and other administrations than you see with these people in power. So, I do think a change, getting rid of these particular very bad guys will take an edge off what is this what I consider major militarism of this administration. Will it be able to turn back the clock all the way? I don't know. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years in terms of war. I don't know if Roger has it.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, you know, are the Republicans the same as the Democrats? And when you look at the really cowardly response of the Democrats, you're tempted to say yes. But on the other hand, I just do not believe that any group of Democrats could put forward these kind of policies. I mean, I think this is, I mean, there's some similarities. I mean, you know, you had Dennis Ross and you had a continuity of Middle East policy between Bush the first and Clinton, but not this. Yeah, no, I don't think this. So I think it would make a difference. I think one of the dangers is that this is an administration that wants to stay in power very badly and understands that, you know, you have wars around election time and it's good for you. I think we're going to see a lot of that.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I don't know if this is actually real, but I've always thought that American policy has a little bit of a consistency. I could be completely wrong. Is these people going in, like say some people do go in and say, no, this is all wrong, let's change it. Will there be things in their head saying, well, you know, we do need to stay pseudo-consistent so that we don't pull out of Iraq again, assuming they're in there and leave all these people who have, you know, risen up or been told to rise up, you know, leaving them kind of in our dust.
I would just hope that the next administration, if there is a next one, it's different. That it just doesn't follow a path of belief in militarism and war, you know, as the main goals of the administration. I mean, I wonder, you know, someone asked today when I was at a meeting, what happened to the hundreds of billions of dollars of surplus, you know, that this administration came into power with? Well, it's going into not only our bad economic situation, but into militarism. And so I would think that another administration will be less militaristic. I mean, that would be my hope.
But I think you're pointing to a real problem, which is that the further along in this war that this administration takes us, the harder it is to reverse history. You can't reverse history. So yes, they are going to have to build from that platform. And if you look at what the plans are, you know, the plans that we've been discussing that are publicly available. For example, the Richard Pearl, who's now got an independent, you know, defense advisory board, which is very influential, produced a Middle East plan which calls for a number of things. Dividing Iraq into three, one of those things, so that Kirkuk is separated, because Kirkuk in the north of Kurdistan is an oil-rich area. So that's talking about establishing a separate little principality. Turkey won't like it, but too bad. Turkey doesn't determine U.S. policy. There's money to be made there. And then central Iraq, with the main population, becomes part of the Hashemite kingdom, no longer just Jordan. That sounds ludicrous to people who know the Middle East. On the other hand, two things about that. One, practically speaking, steps are being taken. So Crown Prince Hassan, who's wanted to be the next Jordanian king, and instead Hussein's son is, he's Hussein's brother, former king. For the first, I mean, he had no contact with the Iraqi groups, none at all. And suddenly he's speaking at Washington's invitation as a headline speaker for the INC and the Iraqi opposition groups being sponsored by Washington. And the ideas floated out of this Hashemite kingdom very explicitly. Southern Iraq separated the oil fields Rumaila into Kuwait. Now, that strikes people who are sane in the Middle East. It's totally crazy, but I think, again, this group producing these policy documents has the belief that, look, the Middle East right now is a result of the British drawing lines in the sand 80 years ago, and that's factually true. Why can't we do it now? We are stronger now than the British were in the region then. Who's going to stop us? And we'll put in, you know, and so, you know, there's another well-known kind of notorious incident where another RAND or another policy institute presented Saudi Arabia as the kernel of evil, and it was first Iraq, the tactical oil. These are the three slides presented to Rumsfeld and his group. Then Saudi Arabia, the strategic oil. Then Egypt, the grand prize, because Egypt is 60 million people. It's the cultural center of the Arab world. So people are thinking along these lines. They need to be stopped. It's crazy. It's going to do all kinds of terrible things, but is it possible? And the farther they go, the harder it is for any administration to undo it.
You know, I give a lot of talks with a woman named Blanche Cook, and she always, professor at CUNY, she always brings out maps of the world after the First World War and after the Second World War. And she says, look, at what they do after every war, they redraw the maps of the world. And they did it after the First World War for England, they did it after the Second World War, and now, after the Cold War, the U.S. is basically redrawing the map of the world in a way that will guarantee U.S. hegemony over the world for whatever period of time they're thinking about, 50 or 100 years. And so in that sense, it is a deep problem that I think any administration would at least on some level be doing.